Hey, welcome back, everybody, to Rooftop Leadership. I am here with Professor, I'll keep saying Professor, and I'm sorry about
Yeah.
that, with Mr. Kendall Haven. He is, in my opinion, the foremost authority on story dynamics and the power of story, and more importantly, how you can use purposeful story in your life to achieve outcomes. And in the last episode, if you haven't listened to it, make sure you go back and hear it. We talked about how story works, why it works, where it works, and he made it pretty clear that all humans are hardwired to make sense out of story. And now we're going to get into what you can do as a leader to integrate story into your life in a powerful way and what makes a story work for influence and impact. So, first of all, Kendall, thanks for being back with us.
My pleasure. Great to
Um,
be.
yeah, it's awesome to have you, and thanks for all the work you've done on this. One of the questions that I didn't get to from the last interview, I want to make sure I get to here is, you talk about when a listener is presented with information that they are hardwired to use what you call in your book the make sense mandate, or
Yep.
the neural story net takes over and has to make sense of the information before the conscious mind acts on it. But you also bring out a very interesting dynamic that when the listener has to use their own narrative versus receiving a narrative from the teller, that a couple of things happen with the listener that the teller probably wants to think about before choosing not to tell them a story. Would you mind diving into that a little bit?
All right. Um, there are two choices. Information is coming into you, and I don't care if you're witnessing something, you're experiencing it, you're reading something, watching a video, listening to a talk, and your brain is always, because your brain, especially at the beginning of this stream of incoming information, your brain doesn't know where it's going. So you're trying to establish some framework for saying what's happening here. How does it make sense? What does it mean to me?
Right.
Uh, and there are these key story elements that we're going to, I guess, talk about here in just a moment that cue you into creating sort of a mental framework that makes sense to you so that you can house new information as it comes in within this sort of mental structure. Um, if you, but if there are pieces that are missing of these key story elements, you have two choices. One, run into your banks of prior knowledge, everything you've learned, everything that you know, everything you've experienced, everything you know that's correct, everything you know that you know even though it's dead wrong, uh, everything that you think of that comes to your mind that's really some kind of prejudice or myth or fantasy, anything. It's all of your life experiences. You run in there and say, really, and then this happens at a totally at a subconscious level. You're saying, what's the most logical to me piece of information to fill in that gap? And as soon as you then bring that back in and fill in that gap, what happens is that in your conscious mind, you think that's exactly what the source material contained. That is to say, what the person talking to you actually said, what you saw if you were there, even though it's not what they said, even though it's not what you saw, so that you are forming a version of the source material. So if someone's listening to you, they're forming a version of what you say that is different from what you actually said. And once they start this new version, it controls and directs how they incorporate all the rest of the information that you provide. So as soon as someone gets off of what you intended, they don't know they've gotten off, and you don't know they've gotten off, but they're interpreting your information in an increasingly divergent way.
Right.
Uh, and it's all because there were certain pieces of this structural information that the brain is hardwired to seek out and to use to create sense, to make sense out of something by creating sort of a structure for that bit of information. If they don't get it, they're going to either get it from their own experiences, or they're going to shut down and say, no, this doesn't make sense to me. It's dumb. It's a waste of time, and tune out.
Yeah.
Those are the two choices.
And that's that second part that you say there is pretty interesting too. I mean, it's really interesting in that the disposition, the emotional disposition, if I'm hearing you right, Kendall, can actually change toward a negative disposition with your listener. If they're inundated with data and logic and not that narrative flow that the brain is kind of hardwired to want to hear.
I'll give you a classic example from the end of my first year at West Point. Right, I'm the end of the plebe year, the day that the seniors graduate and your plebe year is over.
Right.
It's a pretty it's a good day.
It's a big day, right?
It's a good day. And but this is, so school's now over, your plebe year is over, and you're looking in the summer, you look at it as kind of easy time. And within that context, the next day, all of my class was herded into a big auditorium, and a colonel was up on stage, and he was saying, we're going to go out to Camp Buckner and do stuff. And he said, I want you to know, this is not a filler. And you could see every person in that room suddenly go, oh, it's a filler. Good, I can ignore it. And it's because he wanted to influence us in a certain way, but set up the story as incorrectly, as backwards as he could, so that what we heard was something entirely different than what he thought he said.
Wow.
So it happens all the time in work situations. A company manager comes down gets frontline workers and says, we've got a new program we're going to put in. It's going to be a little work at the beginning. It's going to be a little belt tightening. And everyone is thinking, and you watch the people, those frontline workers, and see how many of them think, oh God, this is going to be awful. It's going to be bad for me. It's probably, but it's going to be good for him, isn't it? Going to be great for him. And they flip it. So instead of being something that's a positive, the company's going to work better, it moves us forward into into the next decade, all they hear is, I'm getting screwed. And it has to do with the structure of the story that was provided, and how it didn't create the words that were said didn't create a story that made sense to that audience the way it was intended to.
Wow. Well, let's dive right into it then. If you don't mind, I've got quite a few folks who I work with that are senior leaders, Kendall. Mm-hmm. And right now, as they roll into the holiday season, they are contemplating and planning on how they're going to roll into the new year of 2019 and convey their vision and strategy and direction for the company and what they're building, where they're going. And that's always a challenge, right? I mean, associate disengagement these days is around 85%.
Yep.
Trust is very low.
It's very low. Yeah.
We've got a lot as leaders at a baseline level to contend with. So if I'm that senior leader and I am planning to get up in front of my people and talk about where we're going in 2019, and I'm going to use a story to do it, what are the major considerations that I must take into account to make this effective?
Okay. Go back to, let me backtrack to the project I did for DARPA, called Narrative Networks, where DARPA was really asking us to do some research and answer the question, how do stories exert and control influence. So what that leader is wanting to do with that end of year speech is influence, that is, say, change attitudes, create a certain attitude and a vision for the next year that's going to affect the behavior of the people in the company, right? And so we started with real simple two character stories, and we started to analyze them and found that we could develop tools that let us predict how a story would influence a certain audience if we knew a little bit about that audience ahead of time. And that was all good. That's what we were supposed to be doing. So we expanded to more complicated stories, multiple character stories, 3 character, 4 character stories, and found that the tools that we had developed with the 2 character story worked for maybe 80% of the people, maybe 80, 83, 84% of the people, but there'd always be this group that would be outliers. Now, of course, we're doing the lab work in California, and you figure, well, 20% of California is an outlier no matter what you're doing, right? Except they were all outliers in the same, they clustered. They weren't random. They all clustered with the same kind of responses to the story material. And when we're looking at their at the EEG printouts and the fMRI printouts, the responses were very consistent with each other and yet very radically different from the main body of people that were watching that story bit that we were giving them. And we came down to 4 questions that we realized that the person who wants to communicate needs to ask, because these are the questions that the brain automatically is asking as information is coming in. First is, who's this story really about for me? That is, say, who do I care about in this story? The biggest mistake that leader can make is telling a story about him or herself or about the company. Second question is, how good or bad is the ending of this story for that character that I care about? Third question, if it's bad, who do I blame for it? Fourth question, if it's good, who gets the credit? So what we find is that influence is about anticipating who your target audience is going to identify with in the story, and setting up the story from an identity character's point of view. The main elements then that determine the way a story, whether a story will exert any influence or not, are a character has to have a goal. A goal is what they're after in the story. It's what they need to do or get in this story. That goal has to be backed up by motives. Motives are information that explain why a goal is important. Goals should be tangible, should be real, should be visualizable, right? Something tangible and real. Motives don't have to be. So peace on earth is a great motive. It's a terrible goal because we don't really know what it looks like. Happiness is a terrible goal. It's being loyal. Loyalty is a lousy goal, but it's a great motive. What we find is that if you want your target audience, the people in your company, the frontline workers in your company, investors that you want to approach, if you want them to identify with the character in your story, be it a fictional character or a real character, and sort of see the world through that character's eyes and appreciate the world and empathize with the world through that character's viewpoint, what has to happen is that you, the audience member, need to recognize that that character's motives, their basic drives, values, beliefs, gripes, problems, match your own. It's called motive matching. So if I stop and think, if I'm the one who's going to communicate, how do I want to tell this story? Do I want to tell it from my viewpoint, the CEO's viewpoint, or the company leadership's viewpoint? And the answer is, well, I only want to do that if I'm sure that my audience, the people I'm talking to, will recognize that my motives exactly match their own. Otherwise, they'll put me in the role of the antagonist, the bad guy, the other. Um, so a character has a goal backed by motives, and there has to be something. We'll call it the antagonist. It doesn't have to be a character. It can be a force. Can be competition. It can be new technological advances. Something that's
Change.
change.
Yeah. Yeah.
Change stories, by the way, are never about change. An effective change story is never about change. Effective change stories are about preservation. The story is about what is so valuable that you, as a company, are dedicated to preserving it, and therefore are going to change what you have to change in order to preserve what you're committed to preserving.
That's
And so many change stories want to focus on the change and how difficult it is to get over the hill and suck it up and make the change because it'll be better later. Yeah, forget that. You want to all people hear then is how hard it's going to be to make the change. You want to sell what you're preserving that is of greater value to that target audience. So character has goal, backed by motive, blocked by an antagonist. And then when the antagonist and the climax character sort of confront each other, that's called the climax of the story. And the question is, who at that moment has the power to make it come out the way that it comes out? So we introduce a third character, the climax character. This is the power position. An example, let's take a change story. You say, we're going to, competition is, if we don't change, competition is going to drive us out of business. Our company's going to fold and go down. So that what you're trying to do is then say that your own changes in technological advances are the climax character. They have the power to come in and save the day. And you're setting up outside competition as the antagonist. If you can set up the main character so that your audience identifies with that character, tell it from their viewpoint, then they buy that structure of who's the antagonist, who's the bad guy, and who has the power that we're all going to cheer for, that comes in like the cavalry. Think of a Western. The wagon train leaves St. Louis and on the Oregon Trail, and John Wayne is leading the wagon train because he's in love with a schoolmarm and wants to settle down with her out there in the Oregon Territory. And 5 days out of St. Louis, they're attacked by Indians and they circle the wagons and flaming arrows are coming in. But these are all farmers, and then they don't have very many guns. And even John Wayne is out of bullets and he's throwing rocks at the Indians trying to keep them away. You think, oh, woe is us. The schoolmarm's going to get violated. John's got 2 arrows in him and he's going to die. And everyone's going to, and it's going to be a disaster. And at that moment, you hear a little, and over the hill, here come the pennants and here comes the cavalry in to save the day.
right.
It's the climax character. It's not the main character. John Wayne was our main character. That's who we cared about. But we realized that somebody has to have the power to make that confrontation come out the way it comes out. And that what we were realizing people use in order to decide how they feel at the end of the story, where they feel empowered and they feel happy or they feel completely distraught, is how the main character resolves that goal and who forms the position of the climax character. And so you get into the book Story Smart, and we start to play with some of that. We've done a lot more play with it in the last couple of years after that book came out. But looking at planning a story so that you're planning it so that you're maneuvering your audience into viewing the story and the situation from exactly the viewpoint and the emotional involvement point that you would like for them to have. Then you can get into the details and the flow and those little bits of putting the story together. But the basic story design It's all about deciding who is my target audience going to use for an identity character, and how do I use motive matching to get them to view to link with and empathize with the story character that I want them to use, and then set up the antagonist and the climax character so that they see the power struggle between those two the way I want them to, and then they'll view the resolution with the emotion that I want them to. And that's really story design.
And it really is. Yeah, it's amazing. Go ahead.
Oh, that's a good stopping point to let you jump in and put in your 2 cents worth here.
Well, I'm just, I've read Story Smart cover to cover several times now, Kendall, and to hear you go through it and knowing the baseline knowledge that you have on why story works, I just hope that our listeners, as they hear this, understand that what Kendall's given you is, no kidding, is the design for purposeful storytelling. Whether you are leading a nonprofit, whether you are an active duty special operator or law enforcement trying to conduct community policing, or a CEO of a Fortune 100 company, what he's just given you is just the nuts and bolts of how story works in a design format that you've done some brilliant reverse engineering here to arrive at an emotional outcome, right?
That actually is exactly what it is reverse engineering. And I have to be careful with what audiences I use that term with. Some love it and some go, we don't go there and go tilt and back away. But the bottom line is, I think we're now at a point where we can say story is the sum of a number of individual pieces and elements that are all at your beck and call.
Yeah.
They all want to be your devoted servants. And we've now been able to tear apart the word story. So you don't look at story as a whole. You look at those elements, and you can consciously think about and control and design each of them so that the story at the end, when you deliver it, has exactly the effect that you want it to have.
Yeah.
And that's something that's new within the last decade, the ability to tear apart story at that level, and that level of specificity.
Yeah, and it's no small thing that you've wired up to the human brain and actually measured, responses in real time as stories are told. I mean, that gives such a level of credibility to this work. One other thing that I'll just say, Kendall, as we move toward a wrap here, is that, like you, I know I've seen the dark side of storytelling. As an operator in special ops, I've seen groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda use stories to move people to do things that are, really bad. And I've seen it in corporate America, where purely transactional objectives were used to emotionally manipulate people. And I think one thing that does need to be said is, as we study story and as we are able to ascertain the inner workings of the brain and how it works, that it's really incumbent on leaders to be responsible with this and to understand that when you are dealing with story and human connection, that it's a big responsibility, and it's not something to be done casually or lightly. And it should be done with the understanding that there is a science behind this, that, story is an agnostic tool. It can be used for good or bad, and it's up to us to use it for good.
And yeah, I fully agree that the more I study story and the deeper I get into how exactly it works, the more I am aware of the immensity of the power that you wield with story. And so I would say that the responsibility is really twofold. One is to use stories responsibly, and to the extent that you can, make others aware of how stories work and the elements of stories, so that they are less susceptible to being manipulated by story. I mean, we use stories for good. we're still exerting influence, but you want people to be able to see be able to get a hold of that and understand what is going on with it.
Yeah, I agree, Kendall. That's really well said. Well, as we wrap this up, I mean, I could sit here and talk to you for hours, and I hope that you and I can stay connected. I think we
I'd
we
love that.
operate in a lot of the same areas, and I'm going to talk to you offline about some ways I'd love to stay connected with you. But for our listeners, how can they? We've talked about Story Smart. We've talked about Story Proof. My next one I'm going to dive into of yours is Right. I can't wait to read that one. What else? How can we find you, Kendall, and how can folks learn more about your work?
Easy. Well, I spend most of my time on the road.
Okay.
And doing workshops, doing consulting kinds of work, and so I do that a lot. Easiest way is always is email. Telephone actually works a lot. It gets overlooked in
Right.
our modern age. But email, and I've got a website, kendallhaven.com, and it's just
Okay.
kendall@kendallhaven.com. And certainly anyone wants to call and or set up a time to call and chat about story and answer questions, that's fine with me.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your generosity, Kendall. And as an Army veteran, a fellow Army veteran, I can't tell you how much I appreciate your service. My wife and I run a nonprofit called theheroesjourney.org,
Yep.
where we help warriors learn to tell their story as they come home. And we found it's one of the most important transition tools for closing the gap between the military and civilian worlds that we live in. We've even got a play out right now called Last
Right.
Out that I've written and I'm performing. And just for the work that you've done for our veterans, thank you so much. It's really cool to see an Army dog out there doing what you've done and blazing a trail for all of our men and women that are coming out of the military.
Yeah.
It's just we're proud of you.
And you're right. Thank you so much. And you're right. I think that story, and even looking this doing that story, that sort of that exit story as you come out of off a tour or actually get out of the military, to do that story and then reframe it and change it, so reframe it, tell it from a different viewpoint, and almost see what your story looks like from different viewpoints is a very powerful exercise and a very powerful way to gain real perspective and grounding on that whole experience.
And I think you've written also that it allows you to repurpose even trauma in some
Oh
cases.
yes, oh yeah, and we're starting to do understand trauma and then repurpose it, because I mean, the traumatic brain injury, which is a big topic now, really doctors get frustrated because they don't have clinical metrics to use. You can't take blood pressure and blood chemistry and say, "Oh, here's the problem." So they go off of um, the patient's self-reported experience. And what they find is that the same physical damage can be reported a whole lot of different ways and with great inconsistency. And so for doctors, that's very frustrating. What we're trying to now work up is a program to say, well, no, hold on. In story terms, that injury is some kind of an antagonist. And antagonists only have relevance to the extent that they block a character from reaching a goal. If you don't know the life goals and the short-term, long-term life goals of the person, you can't possibly understand the way they would describe the injury, that is to say, the problem.
Wow.
Because problem is a function of goal. And so really what it means is the doctors have to be educated in how to set up and query patients for the story and put the injury within context of the story in order to provide a much more consistent look at the physical aspects of that injury.
That's fascinating. Well, I hope that you'll consider yourself an honorary board member of the Hero's Journey, an official
Well, thank you.
storyteller.
That would be great.
We'll kick you one of our Hero's Journey hats over in the mail. It's nice and scuffed up like an army guy likes to wear. But
Oh,
we
good.
really appreciate everything, Kendall, and anything that I haven't covered about story that you would leave our listeners with that I didn't ask you about.
No, I would just reiterate this. Story is an incredibly flexible and powerful tool. The goal, story isn't the goal. Story is the messenger. Story is the way that you structure information to carry the messaging that you want to deliver accurately and powerfully to the conscious mind and memory of some target audience. Uh, Story means those elements, those concerns, those various different structural pieces that are all at your disposal and individually manipulable by you in order to use story structure to deliver your messaging, whatever it is. Uh, and always look at story as your faithful servant. Uh, and the more that you get used to tearing apart that servant and building it back up, the more effective your stories will be.
Wow, that's fantastic. What a great way to end it. So I'm going to close out with Kendall Haven, author of Story Proof, Story Smart, Right. You can find him at kendallhaven.com. Did I get that right, Kendall?
You did.
And we're going to post this on our website. So make sure you take Kendall's advice and, learn to tell stories purposefully and effectively, but also help others understand the power of story so that they can get more use out of them and be less at risk for those that might manipulate with story. So it's a great tool. Kendall, thank you again for everything, for being such a great mentor and such a thought leader in this environment. And I hope you'll come on again sometime.
That'd be great. And thank you.
Thank you, sir.